Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event, Healing Divides in School Communities. We're really excited to be with you and to let you hear from our really great speakers today. This event is actually sort of a continuation or a follow-up to a panel that we held during Civic Learning Week, which was really exciting. It was the first National Civic Learning Week. And we heard from a student, an educator, and a school board member about the need for bridging or connecting across differences in our school communities. And now we're getting to this really great practical piece of what are you currently doing? What does it look like? What advice would you give others? And so we're looking forward to getting this is how I can take this idea that sounds great and actually make it happen in my school community. So I wish we had the time to hear from all of you and where you are. So if you want to drop your name and your location into the chat, we would love to see that and kind of get a feel for where people are joining us from. So far on just this panel, I guess we only have 3 time zones covered. No, we only have 2 because Crystal is in North Carolina instead of in Minnesota. So we've got Ohio, Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Utah on the call. Looks like we have Delaware joining us. Fantastic. Some more East Coast people, Philly, Rhode Island. Happy to have everyone here. I am going to give you sort of a brief intro on who is in the room here. And then we will get started. So I'm the executive director of an organization called Living Room Conversations. So we've been around since 2010. We provide free, open source, really accessible dialogue tools to a lot of different communities. So across all different sectors, anyone can use them. And we talk a lot about bridging and the bridging field and the bridging movement and the bridging community. And what I've realized as I talk to people is they don't always know what that means. So what I've discovered is people are often doing this work of helping people connect across divides without calling it bridging. So I know we all approach this from different angles, and I'm going to ask the audience to go ahead and drop this in the chat, but our panelists, we're going to do a really quick go round, and I want you to fill in the blank. So bridging divides is, and then one word, first word that comes to mind. We can do repeat words, that's fine too, but just a really quick, bridging is fill in the blank.
Essential practice.
Bridging is essential practice.
I was going to say essential.
I was going to say complicated.
Complicated. All right. Essential, complicated. It's a practice. I would say bridging divides is understanding. I see bridging divides is hard in the chat. I see, I don't see other ones, but keep populating the chat. It's fun to see. And this is a really easy exercise that I do at the beginning of my conversations sometimes. If we're going to be talking about forgiveness, forgiveness is fill in the blank. What are you bringing to this conversation, or this term, or this word can be really interesting, even though it's so simple. So already a little bit of advice off the bat, and you kind of saw how it was similar but different. And if we did this with all 30 people in a classroom, you would get different approaches. And I see risky showing up. You can go ahead and keep putting those in there because I think that's really interesting. So today we have Irshad Molla, who is the Youth Engagement Partner for Living Room Conversations. She was also a founding member of the Living Room Conversations Youth Council, made up of high school students across the country. She was a fellow with Citizen University's National Youth Collaboratory, where she organized a series of virtual conversations during COVID for high school students across the country. She also worked to bring conversations to her high school and is currently studying at Ohio State University. So wave to everyone, Irshad. Next, we have Sven Holk, who is a civics and history teacher at Derby Academy in Hingham, Massachusetts, where students are encouraged to be critical thinkers and collaborative problem solvers. He works to help students have better conversations in both the classroom and at home with their parents, and has some simple ways to put listening skills into practice. Wave to Sven here. And then we have Crystal Brackey. She's the vice president of Buds at Teach for America and serves as the chair of her school board in Twin Cities, Minnesota. She's passionate about the intersection of leadership, policy, and community engagement to make meaningful change in schools. So a wave to Crystal. Now I'm going to leave you in suspense because I know you already want to hear from them right now because I've just read their bios and you're excited to know what they've been up to in their school communities. But I'm going to turn the time over to Thomas Lee, who's a grad student that's been working with us. And he's going to give you a really quick recap. I mentioned how this is sort of the continuation of an event that kicked off way back in March for Civic Learning Week. And we collected stories and resources from people in school communities. So Thomas is going to give us just kind of a really brief highlight. And then we actually made a highlight reel, a video for you. So we'll share that with you after this event.
Yeah, thanks, Becca. So like Becca mentioned, my name's Thomas Lee. I'm a grad student at the University of Mississippi. It's been a really fun journey, just kind of seeing this sector kind of culminate into this event. Last month in March, we did Pathways to Bridging, kind of just providing those basic introductions to bridging for the K through 12 sector. And we kind of set up this video ask survey where educators can hop on and tell us their stories about how bridging worked in their communities, in their schools. So we had quite a bit of responses in that. And so pretty much this video kind of recaps 3 stories in particular that were very compelling, just from different walks of life. I believe one's from Massachusetts, one's from Maine. And it's just really interesting just kind of seeing educators, principals, administrators alike kind of talk about bridging and the challenges that they face in their schools. So highly encourage you to view this when we send it in the email after the event. Thanks, Becca.
All right, now we are going to get Irshad first. Irshad is also celebrating Ramadan right now, so she may need to jump off a little early, so we want to make sure that we hear from her. And I feel like your situation is really interesting, Irshad, because a lot of people, especially at your age, might start local and then move national, but I feel like you kind of jumped in to these national efforts. So I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit about how and why you got involved in this kind of work.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting you mentioned that. I was very much like a resume person. So I was like, oh my God, I want to do nationals. And then I kept doing it. I was like, this is useless. Like the one thing I realized was like not much gets done on like a top scale level. It's like local grassroots stuff that actually creates change and culture. And that's something I've learned. So I really do like being at grassroots again. But what interested me, I would say I always really liked being in civics. I liked public speaking and that sort of aspect. And I noticed there was such a it was so polarized and like you couldn't talk about politics. And so that one thing I noticed is if you ever mentioned politics or real life issues, your teachers would be like, stop talking. Like this isn't allowed in school. And I'm like, school is a place to talk about these things. So it was a very conflicting thing for me. And so when I went to, like Becca mentioned, I was in the National Youth Collaboratory. That was like the first space I was like, no, talk about it. Like this is an open space for children, for students to say like what events happen in your life and like why does this matter. So that I really liked that aspect of like student voice, and I tried to bring that back to my high school. And so that's kind of that link I thought was missing, was what I was trying to connect with my work.
And I mean, you mentioned a little bit about this distinction between on the national level, it's a slow moving machine, right? And at the local level, you really get to see some of the change. You get to have the conversations. You get to feel like you're making an impact on your community. And you kind of need both, right? Like if everyone's just working in local communities and we don't get to hear about all the good work, then we don't realize how many people care about this and are involved in it and are trying to sort of shift our cultural norms toward these like curiosity and empathy and listening and bridging differences. So what were some of the concrete things that you experienced or organized or participated in that you started to see some shifts? And you can start
Sorry.
high school or wherever you want to start.
For sure. So I hosted a lot in high school, and that to me was very eye-opening. So when I did it in high school, I always thought that like especially teenagers just didn't care. I thought apathy was the issue. I was like, oh, they just don't care about these issues, or like they care about whatever else more, like pop culture more. But then the more I hosted these conversations about rate, whatever it was, I realized it wasn't apathy. It's not that they didn't care, it's that they thought no one else cared about listening to them. And that's like really the issue. I remember actually hearing a TED talk the other week at OSU, and he was a political scientist, and he talked about in general, like Americans, like it's not that they're apathetic, it's that they're frustrated that no one's listening to them, which is why they don't try to educate, which is why they don't try to learn about these things. So that's the one thing I learned. Very like one concrete thing was just like being heard is very important. And like I would have high schoolers come up to me and be like, oh my god, I didn't know I had that much to say, or I didn't know I cared about something that much. And it's not until you give them a space to actually open up. And the other thing I realized, like another positive effect, is like you see on the news or whatever, like once people have a disagreement, they just start fighting each other, or it's like very crude, very violent options. And once you start teaching them at like an earlier age what disagreement looks like, or what does it mean to actually listen and calm down, then you start to stop those like very polarized, violent, like sort of outcomes you get as older kids. So like those are like definitely the two concrete things I've seen from my work.
I love that. I am wondering, what did this process of bringing students into the conversation actually look like? So that you obviously created space, people got to speak up, they got to feel seen and heard. You discovered things like maybe apathy isn't the issue, but what was the actual tool, or how did you do that? How did you bring students together? Was it in the classroom, after school club? Like what did it look like?
Yeah, my teachers are very nice. So my AP Gov teacher let me use his classroom. So it was like in person in class, like during class period. So it wasn't after school. So everyone was kind of had to participate. But I will say that's why when we did the bridging like that, I said complicated because it was very frustrating at times. Like I said, because kids are told not to say anything, like there were so many times there were just like dead silence, like people would not say anything, and it was just like you had to pry and pry and pry and pry because they've just been conditioned not to say anything. So that I remember was very frustrating. And it's just like it seems so simple. It's just like, oh, you're talking, I'm listening, but it's actually not that simple is what I've realized. So that's why I think like schools are definitely like the incubator, so you have to really go in there. I remember I would show a clip from the Dick Van Dyke Show, which is from like the 1960s. I love that show. But he says in that, where this was during like it was during like the civil rights movements, and they were one of the only shows to like talk about diversity. And he says like he wins an award for diversity, and he goes, I don't know why I won this. And he says, um, like kind of understanding should be as easy as breathing. And I really like that, like the analogy kind of uses. So I play that clip for them before we start the conversation. But again, as easy as it seems, it's very hard in practice. But I think the more we do it and the more we have conversations, it'll become as easy as it seems.
I love that. Just one more kind of like, what did that conversation look like to have your AP Gov teacher let you use his classroom and his class time? Were you leading the discussion? Were you working with him to lead the conversation?
No, he gave me full it was funny. So I went in there and I was like, I need the slide. I just kept giving him like things to do. And he's like, Irshad, you've been in here for 5 minutes and I've been doing so many things for like calm down. But no, he let me like sort of take the front end of everything. So I put slides up. So we did a very quick like 10-minute intro. So like the Dick Van Dyke episode was shown. And then I talked about why, like, what does using your voice mean? Because people think it's just talking, but it's also like through art, it's all through sports. So like empowering these different channels. And then after that, like 45, 50 minutes, they're split up into groups, and then they would do discussion questions, and I would go around kind of just hearing what people were saying, or more prying because a lot of kids weren't saying anything. But that was sort of the run of the show in high school.
So in those discussion groups, were students just self-facilitating the conversation?
Yeah, for the most part, I would put a question up and I'd say, okay, guys, discuss. And then we'd kind of go around and talk about it. Yep.
Were they always with the same groups, or did you kind of mix up the groups?
No, actually what we did was we would do groups, and then after one question, we would the whole class would reconvene and talk about, like, people would highlight what they talked about and it would be a class discussion, and then you'd go back to small groups, but you would stay within who you were picked with from the beginning.
Okay. And did you notice any differences in the classroom dynamic?
Um, what do you mean specifically by that?
I mean, so if you've had these conversations or something that you would do regularly, how
Mhm.
did other classrooms that you were in, like, was there sort of a change in dynamic in the classroom itself because you were leaning into having these conversations? Did it help start friendships, or was there any sort of thing that you noticed just by doing this?
I wouldn't say. I think it's maybe there was. I didn't know myself, but I did definitely hear a lot of kids say, like, the aspect I said, where like, oh, I didn't know I had this much to say. So that was a prominent thing that came out, which was like, I didn't know I cared about this issue that much. Like once they started talking, they couldn't stop talking, is what they were saying. So that dynamic definitely shifted.
Love that. And what um advice would you give to other students who are thinking about trying to do this at their school?
So when I went in, I was very much like, I was very naive. I was like, this is gonna be so easy and everyone's gonna listen to me and it's gonna be perfect, but it was not. I would say the biggest thing is just perseverance. It's a very tedious process, but because it's tedious, it's very worthwhile. I think the most impactful things take a lot of time. Like nothing in life that's valuable comes easy. So it's very tedious, it's very grueling and long, but I would say just like persevere, stick with it. And the other thing I would say is we're like, as a society, we love like big numbers. We're like, if you hit like, especially national like levels, they're like, oh my God, you have this much money in grants, or like you impacted this many people. But the one thing I realized was like, even one kid coming up and saying like, oh my God, you opened my perspective, or like, thank you for giving the space, was like more than enough at that point. So it's like even tiny little impacts like kind of rain into the big ones. So those two things.
I love that. And Urshad's example, working with a civics or government teacher and holding these conversations, um, it's one of the ways this can be done. I've seen it done in clubs as well. In my local high school, they did a series of conversations with an outreach club. So they picked people from each grade who were kind of led toward leadership or service, and they created this outreach club that would also hold, newcomer sort of meetings for new students that were moving in all of the time. And there were athletes, they were from art and dance. It was a whole like mix of students. And they had a series of conversations as part of their monthly meeting where they talked about the golden rule and who they saw in their school community that might be in need of an extra attention of the golden rule of being treated with kindness. And then they came up with service projects in the school. So the conversation can be a starting point to other actions and other things. I mentioned civics and government classes, and we have a civics and government teacher here, history teacher here. So I'm going to turn my attention to Sven, and sort of ask you the same thing. What are some of the activities that you do with your students, and what inspired you to do them?
Yeah, even, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders still want to have those conversations. They're probably a little less inhibited, so they're willing to maybe say crazier things or take big swings, but they also can be very worried too about how they're perceived and oh, well, my parents told me I'm not supposed to talk about this at school. And you definitely hear that and see that reaction. But some of the ways that, I guess, just to go back a step, the Trump election was, I think, the big point for me to say, oh my God, like this is nuts, the kind of rhetoric that people are getting into. And then, COVID and just everything has said to me, we got to learn how to listen to each other, and we can't practice listening to each other with easy stuff when we're like agreeing with each other. We need to learn to listen to each other when we don't agree. And middle schoolers, that's good. They're good at not agreeing with each other. And so there are a lot of different materials I found. Some of the activities I've sent home, there's a nice thing. And by the way, there's a guy on this Zoom up there. He's kind of a ringer. He's hiding and he's backlit. He's not very well lit, but Kent Lency, one of my mentors, and actually our school, when we were getting ready for the Biden election, a lot of teachers were so worried about how to talk about it and just really concerned. Oh, that's just you, Mr. Hulk will talk about it. And I thought we really need our whole faculty to be comfortable in answering or directing or somehow, not being scared to talk about some of these things. So Kent Lency and his program came and he did a consultancy with our teachers, which was really helpful to get teachers to feel like, okay, I actually should not shy away. It is important to talk about these things. And as we see in the news, we just keep getting bombarded. But the kids see and hear everything, and they want to go for the most, drastic kind of stuff. They're really attuned to the things that are the most shocking. But it's really easy to have more structured conversations around things like, should the debates. There's constant debates that. One place I find them is Upfront Magazine, which is scholastic in the New York Times, put together a great kind of social studies current events magazine. And in the very back, there's a debate every week, like a yes or no question, and forcing the kids to read both sides and then take a side that they don't necessarily agree with and argue it to a neighbor. And then they have to hear what their neighbor said. And then they have to report out to the class what their work partner or neighbor's opinion was. It's a lot of listening skills. It's definitely a lot of listening skills, but then they practice that over and over with things that are not weighty, I guess, or maybe don't necessarily involve their sort of family values and morals that can get tricky. So then eventually towards the middle end of the year, we send home assignments like, do you believe in smaller government versus bigger government? After having done a lot of work leading up to that and having that be an assignment they do at home with their parents. No judgment, bigger government, smaller government. There's positives and negatives of both. And what does that mean to you and your family? And that's a fascinating jumping off point to having very differing perspectives and for the kids to hear each other. That's one starting point. There are also the clubs. We just started a current events clubs with our 7th and 8th graders, and sending home a email ahead of time saying there will likely be some controversial topics that get discussed, and we plan to keep it school appropriate, age appropriate to the best of our ability. Feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns. And I didn't get a single email back from 15 parents telling them, we're doing this, and nobody's that stressed or worried. I'm sure something will come back at some point, but so I think the clubs aspect, that route, doing some classwork exercises with listening and taking different viewpoints, maybe some homework getting sent at home, and then work with your faculty as much as possible has been a nice recipe, I think, in the last few years. And middle ground schools, Kent Lency in his new book, quite the guy. Yep, just plugging it. Anyway, I'll stop there.
We love Kent too. I love what I heard from you of these different levels of capacity building, right? Like investing in the students and teaching them how to disagree, teaching them how to listen, and really building their capacity for, entering the world, which is full of a lot of people's different opinions and positions, but also building the capacity of your staff and saying, how can we be more comfortable? Because this will come up. My son was in 1st grade for the 2016 election, and they did this sort of, everyone gets to vote for whoever. And after school, I asked him who he voted for, and he said, I didn't know who to vote for because Donald Trump hates women and Hillary Clinton kills babies. And I was like, whoa, like let's talk about where that comes from, because you're right. Kids hear things and they latch on to the most extreme, simplified version of it, which if that was your if that's your frame of reference and you think one of those two people are coming are going to be president and that's all you know about them, that's terrifying. The world becomes a scarier and less certain place. So I love that not only are you building the capacity in the students, but in the teachers to kind of field these sort of things instead of just maybe shoving it aside or ignoring it, or we don't talk about it, which again signals to kids that I don't know what is, but that you're also building the capacity in the parents and sending things home with families to say, you know, maybe you don't know how to talk about these sorts of things, but here's an assignment you can go through with your child. And so you're building the capacity in the families as well to say, oh, we can talk about this, which is all so reaffirming for this younger generation of students and humans who will eventually step into leadership positions to know how to have these conversations at such a young age and then be able to bring it to the rest of their lives. So I really appreciate that you're not just focusing on like, this is my curriculum in my classroom, but that you're expanding it to say, this is how, as a school community, we increase our capacity to be able to have these conversations that aren't going away, right? They're not disappearing, even though we may avoid them or ignore them.
Yeah, yes, all that is true. And I also made me think just recently of some of the students wanting extra time to sort of research whatever they thought was going on in North Korea. That idea that the most drastic, the most sort of shocking, whatever they can find that's shocking, they really are attracted to, like you said. And I'm also reminded, though, that kind of explains that adage that, you know, adults are really just grown-up children, right? There is that explanation that the kids can understand, that we all love the dramatic end on this side or the extreme on this side, but the extremes are still a very limited amount of what people are actually doing in the world. And they get that. I think they get that. But yeah, through the practice, through doing this work, I think you get emboldened, I guess is the word, that you know, I know something's going to come back and bite me in the butt soon, but it's just and I think that's the risky part. But at the same time, I think it's riskier to not do it and to not have the kids trying and knowing that there's a whole set of ground rules we set up before we do all these listening activities, like, you know, having to draw something that someone's explaining to you with your back to them. I think it's the same thing that couples do in couples therapy. But, you know, all these listening skills kind of are really important for the kids on the most basic level, because they can't get enough of it.
And it's something we take for granted that we all know how to listen. But practicing it is and focusing on it, I think, is really different. And something that I've discovered again and again is that when we set aside the time and intention for these sorts of things, we get different results. And it really does build our capacity and deepen our skills so that when we're caught off guard by something, we've been practicing it. We know how to handle this conversation. We know how to ask questions. We know how to be curious. We know how to go and do research. I love that your students were like, oh, I want to find out what is going on in North Korea. And it's such a healthy way to deal with conflict, because conflict is inevitable. And so we either have healthy conflict or we have high conflict. And so we need to be able to be more comfortable with this sort of healthy conflict. And speaking of healthy conflict, I feel like school boards have gotten their fair share of healthy or high conflict. And Crystal, I know that you work with your school board. You also have a background as an educator. And so I would love to sort of hear from you, like, where are you seeing this sort of conflict or tension show up in your school community?
In about 83 million different ways is the honest answer. And it's different every day. And I think as somebody who has been on the school board for 8 years now, I feel fortunate that I have at least some history, especially before we got to these last 3 to 4 years. Because I do feel so much more comfortable with conflict and really actually getting into it, and that it is not a bad thing. It is a healthy thing, and it is a human thing, and it's how we navigate it and how we stay in community with one another, even as we are in conflict and disagree, is one of the things that I've become really passionate about as a board member, and one of the things that I really try to orient to as a board chair.
And like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah. I can
Actually,
share.
it's
Share
that.
some specific examples.
Yeah.
And they're hard. So I will be honest in advance. I'm going to talk about some tough stuff. But I remember it was almost exactly 2 years ago, feeling really proud of a decision that we made as a school board to remove the metal detectors in our schools. And it was a unanimous decision on the part of the board. It was the superintendent's recommendation. Even though we knew that there were mixed feelings on the part of staff, we felt very clearly and very strongly that it was the right call. And then last year, tragically, we had a school shooting, which unfortunately is not as uncommon as it used to be. And one of our students was killed at our building, and 2 of our students were arrested and are currently incarcerated for his death. And as you can imagine, there's all sorts of trauma and all sorts of conflict that comes up about how this happened, and the different levels of responsibility that we all have and hold in these moments. And then what do we do from here? And being the board chair in these moments is something I never thought I would need to experience. But it was really important for me to think about how to center people and their emotions and the conflicts that we were having, and be really thoughtful about how we moved forward from that point. And that it was not going to be a series of easy decisions that we were going to make, including the metal detectors, and revisiting that particular issue and that particular decision as a school community.
Were there, because I really appreciate you sharing that. I think it's kind of probably for most of the people on this call who deal with school communities, that's like the nightmare scenario.
Yeah, worst case scenario. Absolutely.
And so I'm wondering, like, what did you fall back on? Like, how did you get through that? How did you bring, how did the school board try to bring the community through that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things really guided me as the board chair, and how I wanted us as a group to see ourselves. One is that we were the least important group of people, even though we theoretically have the most power, as far as seniority, as far as the ability to make formal decisions and take formal action. So it was, we cannot center ourselves in this moment. We actually need to center our kids, our staff, our families, and we come last. And so anything that felt like we were prioritizing the board or what the board needed was a no-go. And so there was that part of it. And then I think the second part of it was, yes, even though we have the formal power in this situation, like, we are least proximate to the day-to-day realities of what is happening in our schools and the effects of the decisions that we make as board members. And so as we think about the series of decisions that we need to make in the after effects of a tragedy like this, we need to say, who are the people that we should be listening to and should be informing our decisions, because we as a group of people do not have the answers. We do not have the information that we need to make these decisions on our own.
What did that listening look like?
We did a number of things. One is, in many ways, we're fortunate that we have an organization in Minnesota that is called the Minnesota School Safety Center. And so we immediately hired them to come spend time on site in our buildings, evaluating our security, our safety, talking with our staff, talking with our students, and giving us a report of their assessment of where we were and some recommendations on their part about what we could consider moving forward. We did qualitative and quantitative surveys of our students and of our staff and of our families. That was assessing a variety of different safety factors. And metal detectors were a very specific part of it because we knew we needed to get more information about that one decision, because as you can imagine, it's something that people were really focused on, but we also wanted that to not be the only thing that we were talking about or the only thing that we were getting people's experiences and opinions on. And so those are just two examples of things that we did and really tried to take the time to come up with a holistic picture and a holistic set of information before we ultimately came back to the decision to put metal detectors back into our buildings, but to do it in a different way than what we had done before, and to be really clear about why we were taking the steps that we were taking and what it was in response to, because frankly, the feedback from staff and students was so overwhelming that they wanted it, that they felt like they needed it, even though they knew it was an emotional thing and not actually a true safety measure as far as a safety deterrent. The research is very clear on that. We felt like we needed to honor that, but we were going to make some different choices about how we did it.
So I think that's one example of maybe what you tried to change based on hearing from the community, or to be in better relationship with the community, really. And I'm wondering, you know, I feel like what I've learned about school boards and school districts is they're all different. They have different bylaws, they all have different restrictions. And so what's something that you wish, you know, from your standpoint, that communities understood about the work that you do, or the parameters that you have to operate within?
I think like one thing is that there is so much that happens that we cannot share and cannot talk about. And like my life as a school board member would be so much easier if I could just tell everybody, and I can't do that.
Yeah. So have you explored, or what sort of structural changes have you made with the school board as a body to try to kind of connect with the community? Because I imagine, especially after the tragedy, you know, that you want to have more connection. Like you mentioned, you're the least proximate and maybe the least important in your view, and have the most power.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest levers is actually examining the policies that we have that govern how we do our work as a district. So one really specific example is our policy around public comment and the way in which people can come address the board in a formal setting, and realizing it's very intimidating. Like it is designed for people who are already going to be comfortable coming to a space and addressing strangers in front of a microphone. So how do we change the actual experience of addressing the school board so that it feels more accessible and more responsive to our community? And so revising that policy is just one example of how we can do that in a structural way.
And did you revise your policy, or are you contemplating revising it, or where did you land?
Yeah, we have done some revisions and are probably going to do more. So one example of a revision, I mean, it feels so obvious, but it's embarrassing to say, like we had not done it before, was to double the amount of speaking time that somebody is allowed if they need interpretation. Right? If translation is required, no, they should not have to use the same amount of time as somebody for whom English is their first or most comfortable language.
Yeah. I feel like I'm hearing two things. One is that you have someone that can do the translation, and you're also allowing for the extra time, which I think is great. I love how we kind of got this wide spectrum. So you can see, I feel like bridging looks so different, you know, depending on your capacity and also depending on your community. You know, we had Urshad who talked about just wanting to do something by herself, maybe finding a resource and just going to her teacher and making it happen. Sven who, you know, decided to start doing some of this, but then called in national support and had some training and some backup in like, how can we build our capacity and get, you know, better connected. And then Crystal, I feel like your ability to see the need and what you needed to do in light of a tragic event and how that impacts decisions. I mean, we can make decisions outside of that. You could just remove the metal detectors and then this happened, but being flexible enough to say, no, that's our policy and we're sticking with it, but instead turning to others and listening and learning from the people that you're serving in order to better inform your decisions. And so I just want to appreciate kind of the richness of all the different ways that we've seen and all the different tools that people have mentioned. I want to, we're actually going to get a chance to practice this a little bit. So I'm going to just do a really quick, here's an overview of some skills that are pretty core to what we've been talking about. You've probably heard them come up already with what people have said in their remarks. And we'll just throw you into random breakout rooms for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back, and then we're going to get to our what's your best advice for other educators, school board members, school community members, to be able to do this sort of thing. So don't drop off. We'll put you in groups of about 3. And while Thomas kind of starts to set up those, the number of rooms that we'll need, I am going to share my screen and kind of just give a little bit of a background to what we're talking about. So in addition to what I do with my own organization, there's this Bridging Movement Alignment Council. So this is this collective impact effort to say, yes, there is a movement, and how do we talk about it and get people on board and excited about what we're doing. And one of the things that I help with is to lead our training and skills working group. And so we've been trying to identify what are the best practices in bridging, like what are the core skills that all of these organizations that are involved in skill development and workshops, that what are they leaning on? And so what we have discovered is, I'm on, let's see, there we go. Some of these core skills are empathy, listening to understand, and curiosity. And so curiosity you kind of see here with questions, right? Like that curiosity and questions go hand in hand. When we listen to understand, we're not listening in order to plan the next thing that we're going to say or to catch someone or to debate someone. We're listening to try and understand who they are, where they're coming from, what their experience is. And when you ask good questions and you're trying to listen, it brings you to empathy, where you're really trying to understand where someone's coming from, what their worldview is and how it's informed. And then all of those elements kind of bring you to being in dialogue. And when we're practicing those things, when we have the opportunity, like Sven mentioned, to like, actually, let's do listening exercises. Let's talk about listening and learn how to do this again. And we're doing all of these things, then it brings us toward these outcomes. And these are very common outcomes of bridging. It's depolarization. It's the like less othering of people and finding more commonality and seeing people for who they are. Collaborative problem solving. Once you're in better relationship with people, you can work together. And so you get more collaborative problem solving. You build community. You're giving people opportunities to feel seen and heard. You're listening to them, like Crystal said, and then you're strengthening your community. And then you're productively engaging and connecting across differences. We have seen so many unproductive ways to do this that it's really nice to create an environment where you can be doing this productively. So essentially what it takes, so those are kind of the skills. And to be like the simplest form of dialogue is that you're setting aside some time and intention, you're grabbing a bridging skill to work on, and you're asking a good question. And so that's what we're going to practice. So think about this curiosity, empathy, listening to understand. I there's this, what is he? He's a theoretical physicist. Let's see. I'm going to double check on his name. It's Bohm is his name, David Bohm. And he talks about dialogue and that how what it really is this co-creation of a product that didn't exist before. So by me sharing my experience and you sharing your experience, and we're listening and we're connecting, that we've created something that wouldn't have existed outside of that conversation and that process. And so everybody just grab one, like think of one. Okay, I'm really going to try and be curious. So as this person is talking, we're not going to interrupt them. We're going to let them speak, but think about what would those follow-up questions be? Like what would pique your interest in engaging, listening really to understand, and then trying to kind of put yourself and do this perspective taking. So we're going to try it out. This is what we're doing. This is a little bit like the living room conversations model. We do actual timing. So we'll say, okay, you have 2 minutes, and you probably all have a phone nearby. So you can actually do a timer. So you're going to go into the breakout room. You're going to choose one of these questions. You don't have to answer the same question. Just pick one of them that you want to answer, and try really hard to think of a personal experience or what this has actually looked like in your life. Because when you get to that part where you're sharing personal experiences, you're moving away from opinion sharing, and you're centering, like Crystal mentioned, centering as well. You're centering this shared humanity and lived experience. And that's where I can get really curious and interested about another person, even if I know we disagree on 90% of things, because I'm listening to their story. So here are the 2 questions that you can choose between. What does courageous listening mean for you? Describe any times you have listened or been listened to in this way. What happened? The other option is, how do you project your genuine desire to listen and learn rather than debate or judge? And I am going to I'm going to throw these into the chat really quickly so you actually can see them. And Thomas, do you have the room set for 2 or 3 people? How many people do you have in there?
2 to 3.
Okay. So we will go ahead and give you 5 minutes, or I guess we should probably give you more than that if there might be 3 people in a room. So let me see. We'll give you 6 minutes. So you may not be able to interact with each other, but you should have enough time if there are 3 people in the room where you each get 2 minutes to answer one of the questions. So remember, you're going to choose one of these. You don't have to do both of them. You don't have to do the same one. You have 2 minutes. You're thinking about a skill that you're going to try to practice. And I am going to finish typing this other. I should have had this in an easy copy and paste format, but this gives you a minute to think about how you might answer it. So I'll be quiet, give you a minute. I'll put this in the chat, and then Thomas will open the breakout rooms. All right, we're ready to go. And remember to come back, because then we're getting all of our good advice from our panelists. Welcome back, everyone. I don't know what happened in my breakout room. We didn't have the question in the chat, so I apologize. I tried to type it in. It usually brings it with it into breakout rooms. So hopefully that moment to contemplate while I was typing helped you to answer the question, even though you may not have had it written out for you. But I just kind of want to, if you want to throw in the chat what that was like. What did you learn in your conversation? What was it like to try to listen to someone else? Were one of the questions easier to answer than the other question, and why? And if you can just throw any of that into the chat, I would love to hear it. Again, I wish I could go around and hear from all of you, but I'm sure everyone wants to learn from everyone. So I promised you advice, and so I am going to go back to Savannah and Crystal, and see if they have any, if someone's looking to do this. So they're super inspired by what you've just said. And they're like, yes, I want my school board. I want my school to do this. What would you give them as your best piece of advice?
I'll start, kick it off with any kind of SEL or sort of social emotional strand that most schools have now. I think that's a great place to start with, kind of making sure somewhere in the school curriculum there are these lessons on just basic empathy skills, right? On like being able to figure out and identify emotions, and look at really good listening skills. And I was talking with Kent in the breakout room about anger, identifying anger, why we even have anger as an emotion. And the kids just come up with great answers for that. And how do we control it in a productive way or not? So that's one thing. My advice is just seeing where it is in your school so you can find the place where it might seamlessly tie into kind of having conversations across difference. I think social studies is another great place for all those other reasons I mentioned.
Yeah.
And I would say the 3-word phrase for me is resist quick fixes. And so the slightly longer example would be, don't think about it as one conversation is going to get to the outcome that you're hoping for, but actually see one conversation as one step in the path of getting there. This people work, this human work, especially as we're striving to be more student and community centered, takes time. And so resist that quickness and instead commit to the long haul.
I love that. So this is day 1 of National Week of Conversation. There are a lot of great things. The rest of the week, the website is conversation.us, and you can find the different events. You can even click on K-12 school community, and you'll find specific resources that we've gathered for the K-12 school community, as well as some of the events that are being put on. I know that we also have created sort of these office hour opportunities. So those skills that we talked about, listening and curiosity and empathy, will have sort of an office hour where there will be some practitioners there, and you can ask them questions. They'll share some of the exercises and things that they do and the things that they've learned. We'll make sure to include those in a follow-up email to this event. But St. Kent's name has been brought up several times. He is doing one of the office hours. So if Sven's praise has piqued your interest, you can go check out that office hour and talk to Kent and learn from him. And then I know we have Ken Futernick is here, and he is putting on a collaborative event that is for high school students, designed by high school students. So if you have students in your life and you want them to be able to jump in and practice, deepen some skills and practice some conversation, that event is on Wednesday. Again, you should find all of these on the conversation.us website. And so much gratitude for Crystal and Kent. And now Kent's name is lodged in my brain and I keep bringing him up, for Crystal and Sven and Irshad for being with us today, for Thomas for doing all the tech support, for Ace, who Parsi, who is also the other kind of co-leader of this K-12 working group for National Week of Conversation. Thank you all for being here. And we hope to see you soon, and wish you the best of luck in bringing this to your school communities. So thank you everyone for being here.